24th February 2022, Russian tanks and artillery roll across the border into Ukraine. Everyone, including the Russian leadership, thought it would be over in a matter of days. The USA offered to airlift President Zelensky out of Kyiv before the capital's imminent fall. His now famous reply is characteristic of Ukraine's entire response to the war. "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride." The strength of Ukraine's response made the world sit up and take notice. Russia, to their surprise, found themselves facing a determined and well-organized opposition, one that had been silently preparing for this moment since Russia's invasion of Crimea back in 2014.
There's a real sense of Ukraine seizing the future and wanting the future, and knowing that Russia is like a kind of bad, abusive partner, a male partner, which wants to take them back to the past.
This is John Sweeney.
Good morning from Kyiv.
He's been in Kyiv reporting on the war since the start of the conflict.
I felt there was a real sense of, fuck it, we're going to fight this. We're not going to let them steamroller us. And there are a number of kind of complex things going on. But one of them, I think, is simply that everybody has a memory of how fucked up the Soviet Union was. And essentially, Putin is lost in this awful, dismal 1970s KGB outlook on the world. And he's got KGB glasses and he sees everything through the prism. And these are very, very bad prisms, very thick bottle glasses, with only see the world in terms of sort of the paranoid and ultra-suspicious and ultra-nationalistic worldview of the KGB officer of the 1970s.
Unexpected, quite remarkable effectiveness of Ukrainian military and of Ukrainian high command to actually organize the defense of various regions of Ukraine.
This is Dr. Aliyev. He's an expert in war dynamics and the military structures of Russia and Ukraine.
Initially, when the first armed conflict in Donbass started in 2014, Ukrainian military was very similar to the Russian because it originated from the same Soviet military school, and the older generation of old school generation of generals and colonels in Ukrainian army, they would act very similarly to their Russian counterparts. But they learned a lot during that particular conflict, so they've used this quite effective chain of command, quite effective logistics, and they've never relied on the Soviet military tactics and doctrine, which was used previously by the Ukrainian military or is still used by Russian military. So they are relying on this mixture of Western and their own tactics, which they have developed throughout this long conflict.
But Ukraine's preparedness is only one half of the story. On the other side of the battlefield, they were faced by an opponent that was, in contrast, woefully unprepared for the type of war that was about to unfold. Russia's whole invasion plan hinged upon the belief that Ukraine would fall rapidly, within days. They had no notion they would be fighting this war 12 months later.
To win a war, you need three things. You need good morale, you need good logistics, you need good leadership. Ukrainian morale is great because they're defending their homes, nothing better. I've never seen an army more up for a fight, and I've been alongside the British Army and the American Army in Iraq and Afghanistan.
The very fact that Russia has decided to opt for a full-scale invasion of Ukraine 1 year ago was very unexpected, and the fact that they have not succeeded demonstrated as quite a lot of weaknesses within Russian armed forces, within Russian chain of command, within Russian planning.
In particular, when the war started, and then there's this 40-mile traffic jam of Russian heavy metal coming our way. I felt that the Russians weren't good enough to take Kyiv, and they didn't have enough people. And there's something about the mathematics of war, which is that when you attack, you need 3 times as many people at the very least than the defenders have. The Ukrainian army at this point was 200,000 strong, but they actually had about 100,000 cops and customs and others who had guns too, 300,000 in total. So therefore, if the ratio of 3 attackers to 1 defenders, the Russians needed 3 times 300,000. Your maths is good, that's 900,000. A million's better. But actually, if the Ukrainians are fighting like tigers and they really fucking believe in what they're defending, which they are, then the multiple isn't 3-1, it's something like 7-1. So Putin needed to take Kyiv, he needed 2.1 million at the very least. And actually, he hit it with a tenth of that, with 200,000.
Most of the soldiers, officers, and lower level commanding staff, they were not even informed about the war. They were not informed that they will be sent to participate in combat until the very last day, until February 24th, when on the morning of February 24th, they were actually sent to participate in this invasion. And they have previously took part in military exercises, and which means that they have exhausted quite a lot of their abilities. They've exhausted some of their ammunition and fuel and other stockpiles. So they were not necessarily in the best shape to start this massive invasion on February 24th. And when it comes to Russian military command, they were obviously preparing for a very swift and very fast military operation when they'll just roll into the Ukrainian territory, straight to the capital Kyiv. They will capture all the government buildings, they will topple Zelensky's government, and that will be the end of the operation. They plan to complete the capture of Kyiv within 3 days or maximum within a 10-day period. So they certainly did not expect, and they did not prepare for such a lengthy and such an extensive military operation. One thing that they have completely miscalculated is the level of resistance they will encounter in Ukraine.
As days dragged on to weeks, Russian soldiers began to run out of the most basic supplies like food and fuel, and the consequences of their logistical failures became glaringly obvious. Their army was unable to hold the territory they had gained.
And one grandma told me that really quite early on, in like mid-March, some of the Russian soldiers who were occupying, young ones, came up and said, "Hello, Grandma, terribly sorry." Knocked on the door very politely and said, "We're starving. Have you got any?" And they'd give them some potatoes.
Their logistics were not prepared for anything that would last longer than a week. This explains why they didn't have sufficient fuel, they didn't have sufficient ammunition, and they were not even prepared to occupy certain defensive positions for a certain period of time. For example, we would see this massive Russian military convoys rolling towards Kyiv from Chernobyl area and seizing these towns on the outskirts of Kyiv, such as Irpin and Buchi, but they were not prepared to take up positions in these cities because they didn't have any fuel, any sort of logistics established in advance, and that's why they were not able to establish any stronghold there.
What happened was the Ukrainians sort of trapped them and blew up the back end of this long traffic jam, and then blew up the front end, and then slowly blew up all the bits in the middle.
The problem is with complete lack of preparation and with a complete lack of awareness on a part of the Russian military personnel that they will have to participate in such a massive invasion. This is something that has been kept secret by the Russian High Command and Kremlin, apparently to prevent any leakage of information of intelligence, but also that was a major issue. When you prepare for a massive campaign of that scale, you have to train for it, you have to make certain logistical and other types of preparations.
The Russian killing machine was rubbish at logistics. And the great virtue of this, or the funny thing is that Putin is incredibly corrupt, and he has robbed the Russian people time and time again. But he sits at the top of a ziggurat of corruption, and the consequence is that when a Russian army has, let's say, 1,000 tanks, it doesn't, because 400 of those tanks are actually villas in the south of France.
By April, Russia had conceded territory in the north, in Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy, removing the immediate threat to the Ukrainian capital, but still held on to vast tracts of southern and eastern Ukraine. Russia made particular progress in the Donbass region, capturing Severodonetsk in July. But then Western weapons began to arrive in Ukraine, particularly high-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS, that allowed the Ukrainian army to hit behind Russian lines, stalling the Russian army's progress. By September, Ukraine was ready to launch a counteroffensive.
What happens on October the 10th is, I think that the Russians make a decision that actually they're not going to take Kyiv, but what they can do is smash the place. And October the 10th was the first day they sent 80 cruise missiles and 20 drones, 80 projectiles, and it swarmed. It was like a swarm effect, and you can't knock everybody out, all the missiles out. And four got through, 4 cruise missiles got through, and they killed 18 people.
Ukraine rapidly retakes territory in the northeast, including vital hubs like Kupiansk and Izium, and in the south retakes Kherson, pushing the Russians back across the Dnipro River.
For the Ukrainian side, they are keen to continue this counteroffensive operations, which they started with this massive and highly unexpected and very successful operation in Kharkiv region, where they have retaken most of the Russian-controlled territory of that region, and then followed up by a similarly successful but a bit longer-lasting operation in Kherson district. The key problem for Ukrainians is that they need to accumulate the certain number of military hardware. They need to prepare a certain number of military personnel to participate in these operations, and most critically, they need this large number of artillery ammunition, which they would use in this operation.
The heavy metal the Ukrainians have been begging for 10, 11 for a year. Only the other day did the West say, okay, you're going to get it. Once they get it, then the war, which at the moment is a static war, which helps the Russians because they've got 3 times the population, changes into a war of movement. And the moment it turns into a war of movement, it's much more fun to be a Ukrainian soldier.
Russia's tactic of using stormtroopers as cannon fodder has allowed them to make limited progress around the town of Bakmut.
What's happening is they go in a wave, the Ukrainians are exhausted, their guns start to melt because they're just going bang, 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 bang. And then the proper Wagnerites, who are the mercenaries, emerge from the shadows. And that's why they're at their most dangerous. After the human wave offensive has exhausted the Ukrainians, then the smart Russians appear. And that is where they've managed to nibble away around Bakmut.
At the moment, it's a bit of a stalemate on the part of Ukrainian military, because they have to deal with this Russian offensive in Bakhmut, and once they would be able to repel this offensive around Bakhmut, they would probably be in a position to start their own counteroffensive, because by then they should have accumulated a sufficient number of ammunition and sufficient number of Western supplied heavy weapons.
The new tanks, the new armored cars haven't arrived yet. So if you're in the Ukrainian army right now, you have every chance of being sent to Bakmut, where essentially you are put in a trench and your job is to stay alive until Russian artillery kills you. Now, it's completely different if your job is to go and drive a Challenger tank, with this enormous British tank, which is the heaviest tank in the world, and then go flatten some bad Russian tanks.
As we cross the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there is still no end in sight.
Ukraine will certainly make maximum efforts to deliver a significant blow to Russia this year, but it is highly likely that the conflict itself will drag on possibly for another year or maybe longer, because it is not likely that Ukraine would be able to achieve all of its goals within a year.
The only certainty seems to be that many more lives will be lost on both sides.